L214 just secured a commitment from, I think it's the LDC group, which is the biggest French chicken producer, to adopt the European chicken commitment for their two flagship brands. L214 is estimating this could affect up to 400 million birds every year. Tend to be more conservative with estimates. So let's just say, like, even if it's half of that, like over 5 years, that's over 1 billion birds. And I think sometimes we don't pause enough on just like individual victories like this to be like, that's insane. Like, most social movements never help 1 billion individuals. Like they never get help many across many generations of work and thousands of people working on it. And like, this is just one win in this movement. So I think on the one hand, it's easy to get paralyzed by like the scale of factory farming. But also, I think we should just reflect on the scale of progress we make. That, like, when a group gets a win like this, that is so many individuals who are going to suffer less because of that commitment.
Lewis Bollard should be a familiar name for those trying to improve the lives of farmed animals. For almost 10 years, he's been running the Farm Animal Welfare Program at Open Philanthropy, who is the largest funder in the fight to reduce animal suffering. Personally, I can't think of many other people I've learned more from on how to effectively help farmed animals than Lewis, so I was very excited to have him on today. And in this conversation, we discussed the many different approaches the animal movement takes to help animals, whether that's alternative proteins, welcoming new factory farms, animal welfare technologies, and corporate campaigns. We talk about why some of these strategies are less promising than they initially seem, common beliefs he thinks advocates get wrong, why we may not find better interventions than what we currently have, where the movement is underinvesting, and much, much more. This was a pretty wide-ranging discussion, going from very high-level stuff to quite nuts and bolts, and lots of juicy details and facts and information from Lewis, so I highly recommend listening to all of it. As always, you can find the chapters to quickly navigate to place maybe you find more interesting, and of course you can watch this whole episode on YouTube as well. Hope you enjoy. Lewis, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Thanks, James. Great to be here.
It's excited to have you on. We've had a bunch of requests with you, so excited to finally chat. First question we like to ask everyone: what's something you changed your mind on recently, and why?
One in the last few years has been the likelihood of insects being sentient in a way that is morally really important. I've always been open to that possibility, but I think I might have thrown out on a podcast some years back, like 10% probability or something. I think I'm probably north of 50% probability at this point, and that obviously has pretty unsettling implications about the world we live in.
What caused that pretty big change?
I think a combination of reading some of Rethink Priorities' work on this, talking with Megan Barrett, who's an entomologist, and really also just reflecting on the evolutionary purposes that pain serves, and thinking whether my baseline expectation, I think my baseline had been what most people start out with, which is like a baseline of they're not sentient, and I'm updating from zero toward any evidence showing me that they are. And I think what I realized is there's no reason to start from zero, and you should start from like 50 or 100. And if you start from a baseline of 50 or 100, then the evidence should mostly, I think, still from 100 it should update you down. But like the evidence from 50 should certainly, I think, probably update you up. And I think just having that different baseline and realizing, like, yes, the evidence is still not super strong on them being sentient, but like the evidence against is incredibly weak. So if you don't start out with this presumption that they're not sentient, then actually, like, you're quite likely to end up in a place that they are.
Interesting. Yeah, that's like a funny case study of like how important your prior belief is to where you end up. And obviously, if you start at zero, yes, it's very different starting at 100.
Yeah, and I think there's a broader lesson there around how people think about moral weights for animals, right? Like, I think that there is just this natural thing where people start with all non-human animals, or at least not all except for like the charismatic megafauna, like, or their dogs. But like when it comes to like even pigs and certainly chickens or fish, they start with this presumption that they are just many orders of magnitude less important than humans. And then, we'll update based on any evidence within those bounds. And so you still reach very low moral weights because they started out with an incredibly low moral weight and updating slightly. And I think that's just a mistake. I think that, in fact, you should probably start out with much more egalitarian beliefs and then try and update from there.
Nice. Does that have any ramifications, or like how does that impact what you think we should do as a movement? Right now maybe we're spending, sub 0.1% of our total money on this. Yeah, what kind of natural consequences come out of that belief?
Well, I mean, the first thing is we're not funding in insect or shrimp welfare. And so there is a limit on how much funding can go in those spaces. I encourage individual donors who are persuaded of the case for insect and shrimp sentience, as I am, to fund in those areas. I think that there are a lot of really good opportunities. And so I think that's probably the main limiting factor at this point, is just how much funding there is. But even if that wasn't a limiting factor, I think there would be a strategic question about how much as a movement you want to focus on what the general public will perceive as the most extreme cases. And I think there is something to be said for trying to meet the public somewhat where they are at, or at least reach a compromise between reaching the greatest number of animals and reaching the public where they're at. And people, I think, can have very reasonable differences of opinion about where that leads you, but it's not clear to me you just follow the numbers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, this kind of segues nicely into, I guess, hopefully what will be a pretty broad-ranging discussion on a bunch of different questions on strategy and prioritization in the animal movements. And I mean, one place we can start is, I think last year you didn't ask me anything on the EA forum, which we'll link for people to look at if they're interested. But yeah, someone asked this good question of, Lewis, can you essentially rank the different kind of interventions that is happening in the animal movement? And I guess you didn't necessarily say why, but things like cage-free versus litigation versus institutional meat reduction. And I think that there's some things in there that I thought were quite interesting in terms of, the things you put at the top are things people who know you might expect, corporate cage-free, alternative proteins, movement building. But things that were lower down that maybe I also found a bit surprising was, and maybe I'll go through a few of these, and I'm curious for your takes on this. Something like institutional meat reduction, I think was like relatively low on your list, maybe like just below midway. Kind of curious for, I guess, why maybe this idea, so, getting institutions to be more plant-based, why this kind of was a bit lower than other people might have on their list.
First, massive disclaimer that these are just personal opinions. I feel like in some ways I'm like ranking my children, and I'm like telling you what like the worst things are about the youngest ones. Thankfully, I only have one child. But and I will say, I just have immense respect for the people who work on these issues. So I think that oftentimes criticism of a strategy can come off as criticism of the people pursuing that strategy. And that is certainly not the case. Like for all of the strategies that I have a lower opinion of, it has nothing to do with the people working on it. I think there are very talented people doing really good work on these issues. The reason I'm skeptical is because of the constraints they face. It's because of the like objective barriers, not because of
the
them
external
doing a bad
constraints.
job. Yeah, because I think some people are just like, oh, well, they must be really bad at their job. It's like, no, it's really not that. Like, so caveats aside. Yeah, I mean, I think institutional meat reduction is a really cool idea. So I think that, like, in principle, the idea that just as we've gone from an individual to an institutional focus when it comes to cage-free and when it comes to animal welfare reforms, you should do the same thing on the meat reduction side. Makes a ton of sense. And I think it makes more sense than trying to ask individual consumers to reduce their meat. And I think it is more effective than doing so. I think the challenges we've seen so far, first, is it has been challenging to get institutions large enough to make the same kind of scale as reform as we've seen on the cage-free side. So typically, the institutional meat reduction pledges we see operate at the level of a school district or a hospital or a university, rather than at the level of a multinational fast food chain or a retailer. And there are several orders of magnitude difference in the size of how many animal products those different companies or institutions buy. And so I think it's understandable. It's very hard. Like, McDonald's is not going to make one of these pledges. And that fact just makes it way harder to achieve the same scale. The second thing is, I think it is really hard to steer these in a way that doesn't feed in to the narrative of switching to chicken or fish. My sense is the primary motivations that are sold to institutions, or they get institutions on board, is not animal welfare. It is much more to do with reducing the climate footprint of the food they consume and reducing the health consequences, perhaps. And the stark reality is that beef is the real problem on those, dairy as well, much more than chicken or fish. And now I know that advocates have been really thoughtful about this, and I know advocates have been really careful, but I've still seen a lot of cases where it's like Google had this like big institutional meat reduction plan. At the end, they were like, we like massively reduced the amount of beef, oh, and by the way, we're selling like twice as much seafood. And like that already like more than cancels out the animal welfare effect. I think there's just a really similar risk that like sometimes you just can't control these things once they're out of the bag. And so the institution will be like, I mean, I'll give you another example, which was like the TED conference went plant-based a few years ago, I think after it being pushed by advocates, and then got massive backlash from attendees who were like, we can't just eat plants the whole time. And so their compromise was they just added back in chicken and fish and shrimp. They're like, we definitely won't go back to beef because like that's so bad for the climate, and we know that. And as a result, you've got people like, it's probably worse than the original policy was as far as the animals. So like, I'm not saying that it always happens. I think that is just a risk to be aware of.
Yeah, it's both kind of constrained by the size of the institution and like, you don't control implementation. So when there's that option, it's not going to go well. I guess like maybe one example I think kind of like resilient to those two problems is campaigning against retailers on kind of plant protein versus animal protein splits. Do you have any thoughts on that, if that kind of like gets around the two issues you pointed out?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I mean, I've been really excited to see, the Dutch retailers, I think, really leading on this, making these targets around plant protein, and similarly, the German retailers. I think so far, we haven't yet seen significant implementation. So we saw Tesco had a target that just blew through and completely ignored. We've seen so far the Dutch retailers that are reporting haven't reported much progress. And I don't think that, again, is for lack of trying from the advocates. I think this is just really hard to push a retailer on. Yeah. But you're right. I think that those are much more promising in that they definitely address the first concern around the scale, because retailers are the biggest players out there, and also address the second concern, again, so long as they're not also wrapped up as part of a broader climate sustainability pledge that's like, we'll reduce the carbon emissions of our food by a certain percentage or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Next one. Litigation for farmed animals. You had this relatively low down, and this is funny because you're obviously a former lawyer. I think you worked at HSUS doing litigation, right? So yeah, curious for your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I mean, the two things are related. Like, I am pessimistic on litigation because I tried doing litigation. So, I really thought when I went to law school, this was going to be the way we were going to achieve social change on this issue. Like, this has been the way that great social movements throughout American history have achieved change, whether it's environmental movement, the civil rights movement, marriage equality movement. And so it was really tempting to think this would be the same story for us. The problem is there's a massive difference between us and those movements, which is they had laws and the Constitution to sue under. We do not. And so in the environmental case, they have these really strong laws like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act that they can continually sue under. In the marriage equality case, they can appeal to the guarantees of equal rights in the Constitution. Neither of those exist for animals. And as a result, most animal litigation ends up taking very roundabout forms. So it ends up being environmental litigation. I was involved in a lawsuit against an egg factory farm, and after like 3 years of litigation against one egg factory farm, we won, and they were like, good news, we're putting in a manure digester so that we will no longer have an environmental footprint, but like we're keeping everything else the same. Or they focus on false advertising, which is great. But again, I think the most common settlement coming from the false advertising cases is the company just removes the term humanely raised. So it doesn't start humanely raising its animals. It just removes the term humanely raised. But it often replaces it with something like all natural that surveys show people think means the same thing or is even better. So I think that it's just really hard, given the lack of laws that exist, to find, again, this is US, everything I've said so far about litigation. I am a bit more optimistic in other countries. So I think, for instance, in Germany, it seems like public interest litigation has been really critical to some of the major reforms they've achieved there. I think in the Netherlands, Barcadere has had some really exciting results. And so I think within Europe, there's potentially more possibilities on this. There was also a while back in India, it looked like it was going to go really well with litigation. So we got as far as, advocates got as far as the High Court of Delhi and actually imposed a nationwide moratorium on battery cages. Unfortunately, that was then overruled by the government. And I think that's always the other challenge with litigation is if you really succeed, then the odds that the government steps in and overrules you are pretty high.
Yeah, it's funny that there's a similar case in the UK where the law said you couldn't actually have chickens upside down in handling. And so Advocates for Animals, Animal Law Foundation, I don't know which one, litigated against this. And the government said, yes, you're right. We will now change the law to make it permissible. And it was like, oh boy, that's not what we wanted. Maybe a question on a thing that you put quite high up, which I think people often think about less, is you put farm animal technologies, like I guess welfare technologies and innovation. And obviously maybe this is a topical thing with innovo-sexing, I guess, kind of coming to the US, but I'm kind of curious why maybe you're particularly excited about this and if you think what more could be done on this.
I think for a while, all of the technology focus was on alternative proteins, which I think there is still a huge amount of potential there. I want people to keep focusing on that. But I think that sometimes came at the expense of thinking about technological changes that could reduce suffering on farm, at slaughter, and a hatchery. And there's just really been phenomenal success with innovo-sexing lately. So we've seen about 28% of the European market has already adopted innovo-sexing. It just arrived in the US. The first eggs from innovo-sexed hens went on sale. And I think we've gotten to the point with this technology where it is quite likely that over the coming decade, we will eliminate chick killing in Europe and the US. And once the technology reaches a price point where it is cheaper than killing the male chicks, I think we will see global adoption. And that's a pretty incredible trajectory. Like, I think it is just very rare that our movement has been able to completely end terrible practice. And this technology is on path to, and I should say, not just the technology, but also the work of a lot of advocates in getting, for instance, France and Germany to ban the practice once the technology was viable to facilitate its adoption, and advocates bringing the technology to the United States. But yeah, that's made me very excited about what a technology like that can achieve. And I think there are a lot of other technologies out there that we've barely scratched the surface on. And so I think there's a lot more potential.
I'm also generally excited about this, but I guess the one place where I'm not sure where it works is like, the only examples I can think of is where it is basically no cost to industry, or like it kind of has some benefits. And I guess there aren't that many kind of opportunities. I think there's like stuff around, vaccines prevent lameness is one, and innovo-sexing, which is like relatively cheap, kind of one-off administered things, but can't think of many things where it kind of impacts the whole life of the animal. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on this? Like, am I just being kind of too like restrained in my thinking, or do you think there's actually quite a lot more opportunities?
No, I think that's right. I mean, the first thing I'd say is I think there are two different adoption models here. And the one that I think is less likely is just that the technology on its own gets cheaper than the alternative cruel practice, and it just gets adopted on its own. I think that can happen, but it's going to be very rare. I think the much more common one is where technology is going to make the more humane alternative cheap enough that advocacy can push it over the line. So it's going to make it something that right now is just prohibitively expensive, but you get it down to a certain cost point, and a certain amount of campaigning on companies or on governments can push it over the line. And that's where the theory of change that I'm more excited about.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think this will mostly be for one-off procedures. But I think that covers a lot of stuff. Like, you think of pretty much all of the acutely painful, really intensely painful things that are done to animals. So you think of like the mutilations, like the castrations, cutting of horns and all of that. I think all of that stuff is susceptible to this, as is all of the slaughter process, which is, again, the other really acutely painful part. I agree it's going to be much harder when it comes to chronic suffering issues, particularly where there's a trade-off where it's like you just need to give the animals more space. Like, that is not something technology is going to be able to help.
Yeah.
But I do think there are some things like, the vaccine you mentioned on lameness. Like, I think there are some things that may be able to help with chronic issues, but mostly a thing for acutely painful things. But that would still be a huge, huge win in my book.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and actually another one people are interested in is like, for example, like cheaper stunners for whether it can be fish or shrimp and so on. There's one that wasn't on the list, but I think has gained kind of popularity in the animal movement. I guess Animal International does it, and Animal Rising is starting to do it, which is trying to block factory farms being built. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
I've never been excited about it. So I think there are a couple of reasons. So one is you're normally operating at the level of one individual factory farm. In the United States, depending on how you count, there's somewhere between like 15,000 and 30,000 factory farms. And every year, like 1,000 naturally go out of business and a few hundred naturally come along. And just blocking one at the margin is just so very marginal to that enterprise. The other thing is you're normally playing a game of whack-a-mole. So it's like if you stop a factory farm in Arkansas, it moves over the border to Iowa. If you stop a factory farm in Poland, maybe it moves somewhere else in Poland, or maybe it moves over to Belarus or Ukraine or somewhere else where you can't reach it. And then the other thing, which is even better, is like, I actually think we don't want to stop farms in high welfare countries. Like, there's been a natural trend going on over the last few decades. There's been very limited growth in farming in high welfare countries and much more growth in low welfare countries that can then import into those countries. So like, rather than seeing growth in the UK poultry sector, we see growth in Thailand and growth in Brazil, and then they import into the UK. Given most governments' complete unwillingness to apply animal welfare standards to imports, I think it is much better that additional farms pop up in somewhere like the UK or Poland where they can actually be regulated than go to some place where they can't be regulated. So I think we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. And I think that's especially true when you look at the UK farms right now. A lot of the reasons why chicken farms are trying to expand in the UK is to fulfill the stocking density pledges of UK retailers to allow for more space for birds. So I think that the more that we block those farms, the more that we are just impeding that work. And without like any really clear upside that I see.
I generally agree with you, but I'll try still man the other side to make this more interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, I think in relation to the first point you said, like, oh, it'll just go somewhere else. So I think in the case of UK, for sure, and maybe Poland, I'm not 100% sure, is like actually the planning regime is quite restrictive, and actually it is very hard to actually build these farms. So actually, if you do block one, it kind of does seem to make a meaningful difference because actually many aren't getting approved, and this is a huge problem for farmers and all this kind of stuff. So it seems like maybe there is a genuine impact. And I guess the other comment that I've heard, which I think is a bit more philosophical, is like, if we can't even block factory farms, then like, what are we meant to be doing? Like, surely we think this is a bad thing. And if we do allow it here, does that mean, like, kind of, what does that mean for like our issue and what we fight on?
Let's just say we stop it from popping up somewhere in the UK, saying that's clearly impactful. I don't think it is, because I think it just results in that marginal supply moving to Thailand. So I think like, even if you can stop the whack-a-mole effect within a country or state, which is hard enough, there is a free international market in trading these goods, and it is just going to be produced somewhere else. Like if you haven't addressed the demand side of the equation, the supply will pop up somewhere else.
The thing I've heard is we'll try kind of almost like get rid of lots of animal production here. It's like weaken the agribusiness lobby in this country, and then we'll start working on demand side stuff. Which I'm like, yes, like this kind of makes sense. It is possible. But then, but then you have the problem, like maybe you offshored all the production to like the countries where your advocacy is like the least successful, and then you're totally screwed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's like, yes, you have weakened the lobby ever so slightly in the UK and strengthened it in Thailand and Brazil. By weakening it in the UK, you've also weakened how much it matters. Because if you, let's just say you manage to stop, like, get rid of all the chicken farms in the UK, yes, there would no longer be a chicken industry lobbying in the UK. There would also no longer be any effective animal welfare standards in the UK. And you would just have a really powerful lobby in Thailand that prevented any regulation from happening there. And you would just have that really shitty chicken imported into the UK. And so it's just like, again, it's not clear to me like what you're achieving in that scenario. I get the impulse you described of like, oh, come on, this seems like obviously bad, let's go for it. But I think that is like kind of the thing about strategic advocacy, is that it requires you to like step back and be like, I know for a while people were like, well, it's obviously bad if someone's like wearing fur in front of me, so I should just go and like yell at them or like throw something on them. That is obviously good. And I'm like, I think in retrospect, it was not obviously good. I think that what feels obvious is often misleading us. We should, as much as we can, step back and think about, okay, like what are the very predictable effects, follow-on flow-through effects of taking this action?
Yeah. I wanted to ask maybe a broader question, like, what are some things you think advocates are kind of like, miscalibrated on, or like, they have some, maybe people have some belief, obviously this is very in general terms. So from what you've experienced is like, maybe people might expect cultivated meat to come radically transform the market in like 5 or 10 years. And I think most insiders don't think that's the case. Is there anything else that you think this is like a quite common misconception in the movement that is potentially quite important?
So I think the cultivated meat one is very real, that like I see vast over optimism on the timelines there. Like I think it is totally possible on much longer timelines. It's not only going to lead to disappointment, as I think it has already, as people are seeing like cultivated meat companies going out of business and getting really sad because they thought it was all going to take off so quickly. I think it also distorts what the strategy should be. Like I think if you think it's a really long-term play, it makes more sense to get like to invest in R&D, do other things that are on a much longer timeline. A more general phenomenon I see is I think people have this feeling that there are just like a ton of really cost-effective interventions out there, and they're just waiting to be discovered. And like there are all these things that if we just like devoted more resources to them, we would find like tons of other things that are as good as corporate campaigns. And I think the reality is actually that social change in every movement is insanely hard, and that the default for the vast majority of tactics and strategies used in social movements is they fail. Like it is actually really hard to change the status quo. And so I think we've gotten incredibly lucky in both discovering corporate campaigns on our issue and having advocates who've been able to so skillfully use that tactic. And I am optimistic that we will find some other routes that are as cost effective, as impactful. But I don't think we should think that like, oh, it's just a case of like, giving some more money to some local advocates here, and then they'll work it out. Like, I actually think it is really hard to find those things.
Mm.
And, and that also means people should like go easier on themselves. Like if they find that like, the project they tried to do for 2 or 3 years failed, like not beat themselves up about that. Like that is just like absolutely the most likely outcome, because it is the case that social change is really hard.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of like your first point of maybe our prior should be things won't work. And if they do, it's a welcome surprise, not like this will definitely work. This will kind of radically shape the movement and we'll make loads of change.
Yeah, that's right. And I think like the funding dynamic for nonprofits is part of the problem here, where it's like to get funding from a philanthropist, groups, advocates, and they only need to go fund it and tell them why they're like super confident that this is definitely going to work out.
Yeah.
Like if they went to them and they're like, I'm pretty sure this is going to fail, but there's like, a 5% chance that it's really impactful and it really works out, most funders will be like, cool, I'm not interested. And so I do think, funders, including us, should do a better job of being comfortable with that high level of uncertainty and comfortable making bets on low probability things. Again, that doesn't mean you have to bet on everything, because I think sometimes people infer from that. They'll hear me say something like that and they're like, well, why didn't you support my project then? Because like my project's low probability. And I'm like, yeah, it's like you still have to make choices between the two, right? Like you still have to make trade-offs. You can't fund everything. But I think there's something real to like just appreciating in advance how low the probabilities are in a lot of new approaches.
Yeah. I think there's this funny, trap that I've seen written about, I'm trying to achieve this thing, and if there's a 1% chance of me succeeding, it'll be huge. And it's like, well, everyone uses the same 1% benchmark because it sounds small, but actually it can be really high. Like if you're trying to change like legislation in your country, odds are it's like way less than 1%.
Yeah.
People can probably either infer from what you said or from their knowledge of you that you're quite bullish on, I guess, more incremental work that kind of solidifies the wins, kind of builds up over time, and kind of focus on like steady progress rather than trying to shoot for the moon, so to speak. What's like the best argument you have for this kind of more incremental worldview, as opposed to something that's like change happens in kind of rapid and kind of punctuated ways?
We look at the track record of our movement. We have not yet had a moonshot that has worked. And there have been many that have been attempted. By contrast, we have had a ton of incremental reform work that has worked. And then if you look at other social movements, I think the same is true there too. Like I think people fixate on like the one or two things that appear to have been moonshots that succeeded, like marriage equality winning at the Supreme Court. I'm not sure that was so much of a moonshot. Like it was actually like a very incremental state-by-state strategy.
Yeah.
Even if you think it was, like, it is extremely rare. You can't actually think, obviously there's like the French Revolution or like the American Revolution or something, but like, again, like, how did that turn out? It's very rare that change happens all at once overnight. And the much more common path of progress, whether you look at the abolition of slavery, whether you look at work on the environment, whether you look at just any kind of social movement, is it comes in small incremental steps. And I think that's just how the world changes. Like it's just extremely rare you get like this one moonshot that changes everything. The other thing is, I think I really like the aspect of having feedback loops. So I think it's just sometimes really hard to be honest with ourselves if we work on a moonshot project and it doesn't go anywhere. And so I think that the nice thing about things that have relatively short-term feedback loops is you can see if it's working or not. Now, there are ways to construct things like that. Like I do think we need some moonshot projects out there. And I think there are ways you can construct incremental milestones. I think you just need to be honest with yourself and ideally pre-commit to them. So don't just say like, oh, like, it's a success because like whatever has happened has happened. You just say in advance, hey, if we think we're on track to this, we would expect to see this many people showing up to our demonstrations by this date. We would expect to see these kind of other incremental signs of progress. Because I think that people too easily just keep fooling themselves. And I've seen people in this movement keeping on doing the same thing that is clearly not working for decades on end with the idea that like, well, maybe it's just a few more decades away.
Yeah. It's funny, yeah. The next episode that we're going to release is with David Cole, who wrote a book on the marriage equality movement and NRA and other stuff. And he also an ardent incrementalist. He said, no, the marriage equality movement is 100% incremental. They did it in the most favorable states and then slowly worked their way up. Once they had, over 10 states, then they would maybe go to the Supreme Court. And there was other stuff as well they were doing. So anti-discrimination laws, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look kind of under the hood of most social movements, it is fairly incremental, and then it culminates in this big sexy win, and often we forget the work leading up to it.
Yeah, totally. No, and I think there's something here about like how like Hollywood and popular culture misleads us, because I think that like the Hollywood version of social change, society suddenly realized that something was horribly wrong, and a few brave people stood up and protested and marched and yelled about it, and then within the space of this 2 hour movie, like everything changed and there's like a happy
Yeah.
ending, you know? And it's like I think that has just conditioned us to think this is how these things work, when in fact, in almost all of those cases, people had been working for decades earlier than that to lay the groundwork for reforms. And often even the triumphant victory at the end of it, the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Rights Amendment, whatever, is something that still is nowhere near good enough, like is still a form of incremental reform that like still requires a ton of additional work on top of it. So I think there is just this thing that like we're conditioned as kids to think like this is how the world should work. And so we want it to work this way where things happen in these like huge sudden leaps and bounds, but I think sadly it seldom does.
And what do you think are the biggest kind of risks of having this kind of deeply incremental worldview? Or I guess, well, what's the best arguments for the other side?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best argument for the other side is this is an insanely big problem. And all of the incremental work we've done today, for all I'm saying, like it's helped a lot of animals, it's still a very small share of the total problem. So if you look at it as a proportion of the total problem, it's still very small. And I think you could say, like, look, given how bad it is and given it's still getting worse overall, we would be better to just focus on things that could completely alter that trajectory. And ideally, in the suffering caused by factory farming entirely. And I think, if I believed, for instance, that these moonshots were more viable, then I could get quite excited about them. If, for instance, it seemed like cultivated meat was both scientifically more viable and publicly more acceptable, then like, yeah, it might just make sense to go all in on that. It's not just a theoretical debate. Like, it does also matter what the empirical facts are, because it could just be that like we create a new moonshot, like we find some new way of getting protein that everyone in the public is totally cool with eating, and it's scientifically really promising. And then like maybe you should mostly go all in on that.
Yeah. I think I'm glad you mentioned the empirics point, because I think one thing I've kind of noticed, I had a conversation with Ben from Animal Rising on the podcast, and I think he made a statement that in the context of the RSPCA campaign they were running, that this could be beneficial because there's a possibility of ending factory farming like in the near future. And he's like, in the US it's totally different, but the UK is a possibility, and therefore we should be more ambitious. And I think for me, I was like, wow, this is like totally not what I believe. So do you think it's like some, I guess, difference in opinion on like how quickly change happens and how far away kind of our goals are?
100%. Yeah, I think this is actually something that Wayne Shang pointed out to me, that like one reason we have such different views of how social change should occur is because of our levels of optimism. Wayne continues to believe that we will end factory farming in our lifetimes and like maybe in the next couple of decades. He certainly believed, like a decade ago, he sent me like a roadmap of how it would end in 25 years. And like, and so it's like, I appreciate him like pre-committing to these dates. And I told him at the time, like, if I believed the markers that were in that 25-year roadmap, I would be doing things that look way more like what he was doing than what I was doing. Like, it would not make sense to be doing K-tree reforms with like 10-year phase-ins if you thought all factory farming was going to be out the window in 25 years. I do think that is just a major disagreement. And I hate publicizing my pessimism and the reasons for it, because I don't want to make people just like more depressed about factory farming. I don't want to persuade people that like it's it's going to take forever. But I do think that it's helpful to just like be a little more realistic on this. And yeah, if you do buy those really short timelines, then like, yeah, maybe you should be doing a very different kind of advocacy. And that I think that is like a key difference in opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting saying you don't want to be pessimistic publicly, but I think there's also the trade-off where like, if people have these high hopes and then it doesn't turn out that way, then you get even more demoralized maybe, and then what happens then? So it's very hard to balance like what you should do and how you should talk about these things.
That's right. So I mean, this is why I don't go around like saying like we're going to see the end of factory farming anytime soon. Like it's like I think that it is really important to not set unreasonable expectations, because I've already seen people become deeply depressed when those expectations were not met. I mean, particularly you see this around alternative proteins, where people I think thought that by now it was going to be like 10% of global meat, and like it's just going to like massively be on the path to taking off. And I think and I've seen a lot of people become so disillusioned that they not only like stop working on that, but just leave the movement entirely. Like they're like, well, this is hopeless. Like if it didn't all work out in 5 years, then like what's the point of even trying? Clearly that's the wrong reaction. Like, and I think it is better if we set people's expectations of like, no, this will be a lifetime of work. Like you will work on this your entire life, and you will not, almost certainly you will not end the problem in your lifetime. But you can first alleviate a ton of suffering along the way. And second, you can change the trajectory during our lifetime. So like I am more optimistic that we can reach a tipping point during our lifetime where after we have died, this issue does ultimately go away, in part thanks to the work we did during our lifetimes.
I don't know if this is a big disagreement. I think maybe something you said that also strikes me as different to what I hear from other people is like you said, the goal is almost like to be reducing suffering, whereas some people, they don't necessarily view that as the goal. They kind of view the goal as maybe ending factory farming or kind of like some other holistic improvement in animals' lives. Yeah, do you think this is like a factor why people disagree on what we should do next? Because I guess maybe you're more focused on alleviating or like reducing suffering, and other people have also value other like intangible benefits to animals' lives.
I often hear folks who just want to end like animal exploitation, who are very dismissive of factory farming reforms because they think, well, you're just alleviating slightly the suffering. Even if they accept the premise that you're alleviating slightly the suffering through these reforms, they think that is fundamentally not what's wrong with the system. And so I think there's two differences there. One is just like a philosophical view, where like if philosophically you think the problem with factory farming is that it is exploiting animals, then it is true that a cage-free system also exploits animals. And so in that sense, like if you don't think the problem is the pain and suffering it's causing, then like, yeah, alleviating pain and suffering is not that helpful. I think most of us think the main problem with factory farming is the suffering it causes. And I think if you think that, then it's actually much more important to alleviate that suffering than it is to like end the system. So it's like if we could alleviate 90% of the suffering of factory farming without ending the system, or have like a 50% chance of ending the system entirely, like pretty clear to me we should just like alleviate the suffering of 90%, even if it remains in some places and the institution continues to exist. But some people would disagree. I think some people would say like, no, that's not the whole problem for me, or it's not even the primary problem.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, yeah, changing gears a little bit into some maybe future-looking stuff. So what are some things you think the animal movement broadly is underinvesting in and you think more efforts, either time or money, could be quite useful?
Well, I think first about the levers of driving the movement. So I think you look at talent, you look at money, and you look at ideas. And I think on all three fronts, we have some really amazing things. I mean, I think we have incredible talent in the movement. And I think we could use even more of it. And so I'm really excited about the work that groups like Animal Advocacy Careers are doing. I think there's a lot more we could be doing to create the pipeline of the next generation of talented advocates and to taking the current cohort of junior and new advocates to the movement and helping them train up to be more experienced advocates and to be more skillful, to be future leaders. So I think there's a lot more we can do on that. On the money side, this movement is still woefully underfunded. Like it's still just tiny in the grand scale of social movements and social reform efforts. And so I think we need to bring a lot more money into the movement. And I think that one way to do that is through elite outreach, reaching influential groups that often have access to larger pools of capital. And then when it comes to the ideas, I think we need to both keep coming up with new ideas, but more importantly, testing new ideas. And doing so at the smallest scale possible, because we don't have the resources to just like try everything at massive scale. But I would love to see a lot more small scale experimentation with all kinds of different ideas so that we can find the most promising interventions to scale up in the future.
Do you have any specific examples of what it might look like to have new things like a new pipeline for new advocates or either training up existing advocates?
So I think one of the things on talent pipelines that a bunch of us feel like we probably made a mistake in not pursuing, and this very much includes our funding, is around university campuses. And I think there used to actually be stronger groups on university campuses in many places than there are today. So I would love to see a lot more organization going on university campuses to help people become advocates in this work. And I should say, become advocates, whether that is becoming a full-time campaigner or whether that is going into industry or politics or any other career path and being an advocate within that career path. Because I think there are actually a ton of talented people out there who are working in relatively influential positions who care about our issues, but they're not connected to any people in our movement and they don't have an idea of how to affect change. And so I think the greater degree to which we could be going into these institutions, but actually staying in touch with the movement and having people who have the understanding, the strategy, the skills to pursue change within those places. I guess the other thing on the talent side is looking at like mid-career folks. So I think there's been a really nice trend in recent years of more people coming in mid-career, so people who are in business or wherever else, who already have a more developed skill set, particularly around management or operations or other things that you get from working years in the private sector, and are coming into our space to help out. And I think we should do more to recruit those folks and more to reach out to those folks and bring them into the movement full time, or again as advocates within their current roles.
On the bringing more money inside, I guess this is something that has been like a big focus for lots of people. I think recently is, how do we get more money for the movement? We're relatively small in the big scheme of things, $300 million roughly globally, which sounds like a lot, but it turns out not to be very much. One question I always think about is like, if we did have like 10 million additional dollars, like where would that money go? Or like, where would it ideally go?
Just logistically, there are vehicles that could go through, whether that is like EA fund, the ACE fund,
I mean more like practically, like, either interventions, countries, et cetera, et cetera.
I suspect most people in the movement who are listening to this are like, I could use some more money to scale up what I'm doing. Like it's like, and not to say I should just like go to everything, but like I do think we are still doing most things in the movement on a shoestring, and I think that is like in many ways a real strength. Like we have operated as a very lean movement, and I don't think we want to become these giant bureaucracies who just exist for the sake of existing. But I think there is often the ability that we could ramp up our campaigns. So whether corporate or political, we could just put more resources into those campaigns. We could put more resources into the adoption of new humane technology, into alternative protein lobbying. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that could happen to the margin. The other thing I'd say is I think more important than getting like $10 million more this year is getting a steady increase in funding in years going forward. Because I actually worry less about the immediate financial needs of the movement. I don't think the movement is actually that well placed to take like a huge flood of money right now. But I do think that we're getting the structures in place where we could take a lot more money over the long run. And so I think it's more important to build up that pipeline of donors. So even if they're only willing to give a little bit today, could give potentially a lot more in the future.
Yeah. On this question of organizational bureaucracies and all that, I think most people who have worked in very large organizations have a view that things aren't always super efficient, and you're not very nimble, agile. This whole kind of classic innovator's dilemma you hear with like very large organizations. Do you think you have the view that actually maybe if additional funding came in, it's like more well placed rather than increasing staff headcount, but more on like campaign budgets, whether that's advertising, marketing, materials, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on this kind of balance?
So I generally have been more excited lately about things that are campaign materials and other one-off expenses, because I think we have seen across the movement a lot of challenges with scaling. Like we've seen the idea, I think a lot of groups had was like, well, if I just add like a few more campaigners, like my campaigns will get way more effective. And then what they found was like, well, actually, that then created a whole bunch of internal HR and other issues that need to be resolved. And so then they needed to get more staff to deal with those. And then that created its own issues. And then there's this compounding thing. Now, I think in the long run, we need to work out how to more efficiently solve those issues. And so I'm really excited about the work that groups like Scarlet Spark are doing to help groups, because it can't be the case that we're just reliant on like every advocacy group remaining tiny and like, never becoming a bureaucracy in any way, because I think that just really limits our potential effectiveness as a movement. And there are a ton of talented people out there who want to get into the movement. And I would love to find ways to get them into the movement. So like, I wouldn't say like no funding should go to new roles, because there are people out there who I really want to come into new roles in the movement and I think could be incredibly impactful. And so I think one of the things we need to do is more work around creating the structures that can absorb those new people, allow them to be really effective in their external work without adding a ton more internal burden and a ton more bureaucracy and making the whole organization not work as well for the people who are already there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've definitely seen this. You have an extra person, then you need management, and then for both of those, you need an HR person, and then to support them, you need an extra fundraising person, and then it kind of keeps adding and adding, and you're like, oh, now suddenly we're very big and not that many campaigners.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any specific kind of policy areas that you're particularly excited about groups kind of exploring or testing out?
Well, I think this depends a lot on what's possible in each country or region. So I think, for instance, at the European Union right now, I'm excited about groups seizing this opportunity of a likely upcoming revision of the EU's animal welfare legislation. But in that case, I think it's going to be very driven by what the Commission is open to entertaining, which seems to mainly be focused around cages and crates and the killing of male chicks. In the UK, it seems quite possible to seek bans on battery cages, enriched cages, and bans on farrowing crates. I wish that it were possible to extend those to imports, though it seems like probably not. I think in the EU it is possible to extend those for imports, and so that makes sense to be a major priority. And then in the US, I think the top legislative priority needs to absolutely be defeating what used to be called the EATS Act, what now has some other obscure name, but basically the effort in Congress to, through the Farm Bill, wipe out the most meaningful state farm animal welfare laws, like California's Proposition 12.
Mm.
And then in other countries, it's going to vary a lot. Like I think that a lot of time on legislative work, it's just the art of the possible. So rather than formulating like a perfect policy proposal on what like we'd love to see, the better activity is to go around and like meet with a bunch of politicians and be like, what could you imagine getting through, and like how do we support you to get that through?
Yeah, I think it's good that you noted on Prop 12 because I wanted to talk about that. I guess this seems like to me like one of the major threats to the US movement. I guess how worried are you about it, and what do you think advocates can do to kind of like stop the reversal of Prop 12?
Yeah, I'm really worried about this because it wouldn't just be. So, I mean, for those who haven't been following, the advocates passed through ballot measures Proposition 12 in California, Question 3 in Massachusetts, which ban the sale of pork and eggs from caged and crated animals in farms that use cages and crates. And there is now a major effort in Congress to overrule those laws at the federal level. And if they did this, it wouldn't just wipe out those laws, it would prevent any kind of future meaningful farm animal welfare legislation, basically. Because to be meaningful, it needs to not only cover production in the state, but cover sales into that state. I mean, otherwise you have the same whack-a-mole problem we described earlier, where it's like the producers just move over the state boundaries, do their cruel farming next door, and then sell back into that state. And so the pork industry has correctly worked out that this is like absolutely critical to effectively regulating their industry, its ability. And right now, frankly, it's not on a good path. So like there was a congressional hearing last week that was pretty brutal. So, I mean, it was basically showed that almost all the Republicans on the House Agriculture Committee are strongly supporting putting this into the Farm Bill. They only invited industry that was supportive of this, didn't invite anyone else. And even on the Democratic side, we had like 2 Democrats who supported the effort, which is crazy to me. And then you had a lot of Democrats who were just sitting there doing nothing. Like, just like, oh, I'm just, waiting to learn about this issue, whatever, and like not actively opposing it. And so I think we simultaneously have 2 problems. One is the other side is really fired up and has access to the most important people, like the chairs of the House Ag Committee, the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, who will decide the base language of what's in the Farm Bill. And then the other problem we have is that the people on our side are nowhere near fired up enough. So Democrats have just been kind of sitting around on this issue, not doing a lot, with a few notable exceptions. There are some Republicans who have joined us, but again, they haven't been as vocal and as loud as the people on the other side have been. And so, per your question of what advocates can do, I think the most important thing is just trying to get their politicians to speak up about this. So, even if they live in a city and probably have like a Democratic member of Congress and a Democratic senator, like there's still value to reaching out to their offices and being like, why are you not speaking up about this? Why are you not making it a more important issue? Because the Farm Bill will probably require Democratic votes to pass in both the Senate and the House. And if that's the case, then it's really valuable for Democrats to say, I'm not supporting the Farm Bill. This is it.
Do you get the sense that this is like possible to alter? Because I don't know much about US politics, but it's like obviously the Farm Bill is a huge piece of legislation, and for people to go against it on an animal welfare issue seems like a high bar to ask of politicians. And like basically, how likely do you think is that this would actually happen?
Well, I think there are different degrees of possibility. So look, I'll say it's not looking good right now. Like you're absolutely right that like the reason they are throwing this in the Farm Bill is that we could defeat it on a standalone vote in the House or Senate, most likely. But they know that there are a lot of people who would vote against this as a standalone bill. But when it's passed of this giant farm bill that not only provides farm subsidies for farmers, but also reauthorizes all the nutrition assistance for low-income people, which Democrats really want to get through, they know there are far fewer people who are going to vote against it based on this one issue. That said, I think there are 2 things. So first, I think there are some legislators who are actually willing to stick their neck out and do that. One impressive example, on the Republican side, Nancy Mace, whatever you think about her, and she's a lightning rod on other issues, has literally said she won't vote for the Farm Bill if this is it. And
wow.
It would be great to see some Democrats having the same courage that she has had on this issue. Even if they literally are not willing to say publicly they won't vote for the whole Farm Bill on this, they can still go to leadership and say, this is really uncomfortable for me. Like, this is something I would much rather not be there. And leadership can in turn go to their chairs of the committee and be like, you're putting our members or our senators in a really hard place, and we prefer you not do that. And so I think there is still value to that. But yeah, it's a really hard fight, and we're not in a great position.
And yeah, I guess how effective do you think has the animal movement's response to that bid? And like, does that kind of give you any hints of like, oh, I wish we had this kind of infrastructure or this kind of organization that kind of doesn't exist? Does anything that kind of come out based on the response to the ETAC?
Yeah, so I think there are some advocates who've been doing really great work around this. And I really appreciate the amount of hard work that's been done by those advocates. I think we have simultaneously seen some of the infrastructure we are really lacking as a movement. I think the first thing is we have seen our lack of organized Republican lobbying on these issues. So there are a ton of Republicans who are on our side on this. Like the average grassroots Republican voter, we know from surveys, they hate gestation crates. They are not supportive of this. They do not want Congress to take away the rights of states to regulate these. Like, this is not a Republican position. But because we have so little organized infrastructure in rallying those Republican voters, it ends up normally being animal groups that are very left-coded trying to go and meet with Republican officers. And the Republican officers being like, we don't want to meet with you. Like, your group like endorsed Kamala Harris and like, like doesn't, it's like, it's just like so clearly not like, representing our voters. So I think there is a real need for like people to go out and honestly represent those voters who are like right-leaning, who actually do not want this. And we do a huge amount more to organize that.
Do you think that's more, trying to have like a large supporter list, quite like a public-facing NGO, which then kind of does like supporter actions to email your representatives, like that kind of like, what kind of organization are you specifically kind of thinking of? I think that'd be quite useful.
Yeah, it could be that. I mean, I think like realistically, where you start is probably smaller than like a mass, member list. But like, I think that there is oftentimes just bringing representatives of that community to DC is very valuable. So like one thing that I think has been very effective in this farm bill work is that there are some small farmer groups who have brought small farmers who are benefiting from these farm animal welfare laws to Congress to talk about it. That has been incredibly powerful. And I think if that movement were better resourced, if we had better groups established in that space, there are so many more small farmers out there who are just like actively opposed to what the pork industry is doing here and are not having their voices heard. And with more organization and mobilization, we could help them have their voices heard. I think the same is true when it comes to Republicans on this issue. So like there are conservatives around the country who are concerned about this issue. We could be doing what the pork industry is doing, which is like flying them to DC, setting up meetings for them with their representatives and senators, and organizing that. Again, there are people doing this on a shoestring budget. I think this could be done at just a much bigger scale if we had the infrastructure and the resources.
Is there anything else that comes to mind on this infrastructure piece? We move on.
I mean, I think the more broader mobilization of animal welfare voters is a really important thing. So I think that for too long, either the groups organizing animal welfare voters have just prioritized dog and cat legislation and have basically just ignored farm animals, or they have not politically mobilized in an effective way. And I think that there is a need for someone to represent the majority of Americans who actually really care about animal welfare and are not happy about things like this. It will be very hard to do that, I think. Like, it is just hard to break through the noise. It's hard to establish yourself as a new lobby in DC. But in the long run, I think that's a voice that needs to be heard.
I think it's actually something we're trying to do in the UK with UK voters for animals for similar reasons. Is like there's lots of really good kind of grassroots and mass corporate engagement for animal welfare, which has been very effective in getting lots of major companies to understand the kind of depth and breadth of feeling. But this hasn't really translated through to the farm animal welfare political engagement. And I think you're right in that either groups focus on things that are maybe more tractable and mobilize a base, which is like cat and dog and trophy hunting and other stuff, or they just don't turn out many people. But yeah, so I agree. I think this is somewhere where I think I'm excited for more groups to try this kind of work.
The UK is a great place for that. It's like the UK probably has some of the strongest sentiment around farm animal welfare in the world. And it was wild to me that like when the Labour Party put out its manifesto before the election, also not its manifesto, but put out like 8-point plan on animal welfare before the election, farm animals weren't listed. I mean, it's just outrageous. It's outrageous that they think they could get away with like an 8-point plan that is like dogs, cats, trophy hunted animal. It was like nothing about farm animals. I think it's pretty bad too that they still haven't done anything on farm animal welfare. I mean, it's like there's just such huge public support on this issue.
Yeah.
And there continued willingness to I read the debates that have been going on in Parliament about cages and crates, and you just get MPs from across the aisle saying the public so strongly supports change here. And then the minister gets up at the end and is like, thank you so much. We're considering all of this. And it's on other issues, that would not be an acceptable response that we're just considering it. We're thinking about it. We'll just keep on thinking about it. It's on other issues, we'll actually demand change on this. And I think that's where better mobilization could push things through.
Yeah, so actually we're organizing a mass lobby day. We're trying to get 100 people plus to come to the UK and actually talk to MP about this. Because I agree. I think that there's been a lack of actually talking, even though I think you're right that MPs are supportive. It's partially, I guess, for also their personal reasons, because most people do agree that cages are bad. But I think have a bit more constituent pressure, I think, is always useful, and I guess it provides legitimacy for MPs and others to do the stuff. So we'll see how that goes. So we've spoken a bunch about US and the UK for a bit, but obviously most farmed animals don't live in those countries. They're kind of disproportionately in either Southeast Asia and some other places like Latin America. And I guess, what are your thoughts on what we should be doing there? I think the kind of model I have in my head is, in most places you try and make progress on the low-hanging fruit, which is often corporate progress. And then once you have enough of the market switched over and you also build your base, then you can go for more ambitious things, maybe including legislative victories. Is that kind of roughly the model you have in your head, or how do you think about change in these other regions?
I mean, I think we should do whatever works. So I think that we've supported groups across Asia and across Latin America, and they have pursued different strategies based on what they've been able to get traction for. And I think that is the appropriate way to do this. I don't think that us based in the US should set a one-size-fits-all model. I also don't think we can just defer exclusively to local advocates if they're not achieving anything. We see the same dynamic in every country that we see in the US and Europe, which is there are plenty of advocates doing things for dogmatic reasons because they wish this was the way the world worked, because they wish that their campaign had worked out and it hasn't. And so instead, I think we should just try out a lot of different potentially promising things and double down on the things that have worked. And I think so far, one surprising thing has been that the tactics that have worked seem quite similar to what has worked in the US and Europe, which is to say that corporate campaigns have been relatively effective from a low base. Initial legislative lobbying has gotten some positive initial traction. Awareness raising around undercover investigations and things like that has had some impact. And a lot of other things have just really struggled. Again, I don't think that's surprising. Change is really hard. But I think we should mostly just be trying to get things started. And so there's an aspect also of just movement building, where it's you want to build up a movement in these countries. But I think you need to be careful that it's not just movement building for its own sake. A movement needs to do something. And so I think it is generally more effective for movement building if you are, yes, having people meet, yes, convening groups, but also having them do some kind of advocacy and actually start seeing what they can get traction on.
Yeah, I totally agree. I often find that that's kind of good for two reasons. Movement building with a purpose. A because you attract the right people. If you attract you attract doers, if you're actually trying to achieve something rather than people who just want to sit and talk shop all day. And also people get excited about actually doing stuff and winning and progress. And I think that's how you kind of retain, I think, the most.
I think in general, winning is just incredibly important. So it's not just the obvious thing of, yes, you can win reforms for animals, but even winning really small victories that maybe don't help a lot of animals, I think are really important to motivating activists, motivating donors, sustaining activists, getting them experience. And so I think that finding hey, what are the initial small wins we can get is also often a really promising thing to do.
I'm kind of curious what your definition of small is there, because I think one thing we've thought about, or one trap you can fall into is we'll do stuff on trophy hunting in dogs, kind of get people excited and have some wins. But actually, that policy stuff also takes 5 or 6 years. And is that the best use of time? I don't know. So what is your definition of small when you say go after small wins?
Yeah, I don't think farm animal advocates should be doing things on trophy hunting or dogs. I think, first of all, it really matters is this thing you're campaigning for actually going to lead to more support for farm animals in the future? And I think what we have seen in the US, for instance, is we've had huge progress for companion animals, and that has just not trickled down to farm animals. There was this theory that if we just get enough people to make enough progress on companion animals, then everyone will focus on farm animals. In fact, what happens is they just want more progress for companion animals, like rightly so. But like, it's
Yeah.
like actually no one ever switches over, and if you try and switch them over, they're like, no, I was here for the dogs, not the pigs.
Yeah.
Instead, I think you need to get people started on the animals that matter. I have the same problem with like kind of non-human rights project approach of like we'll focus on like elephants and chimpanzees, where I'm like, even if you win, which I sadly don't think they will win, but even if you did, I don't think that trickles down to chickens and fish. Like, I just think it gets people like to care even more about elephants and chimpanzees. And so I think you have to focus on actual farm animal welfare stuff. Then in terms of, what is a small win? Like, I think getting like a small change to regulations that like, is only incrementally making like the slaughter process a bit better regulated, or getting a commitment from a small company, or even just getting this recognized in official documents, or I think there are other things like you can do that are not like the biggest thing, or just getting someone in the agriculture department who's working on animal welfare. I am very wary of the thing of like we should work on different issues in the hope that one day we will then be able to like pull people across to work on the issues we actually care about.
Yeah, I also haven't seen that work out very well, but you can see the natural appeal of that. And
the other risk I have seen is that like I've seen so many people who convince themselves with these stories where it's like, when I was in the Humane Society, like one thing they'd say is like, well, yeah, we're not working on like farm animals now, even though we totally care about them. But like, it's because it's just way more tractable to do this thing in Congress. But like ultimately we'll switch across to farm animals. And then I've seen people who've like retired now who had that like mindset their whole career. And like, how did it work out? Like, did that ever happen? And I think part of the problem is you just like once you start focusing on trophy hunting and dogs, like you end up getting really fixated on that. And you end up like understandably just like fixating on that goal. And that becomes the goal. And you forget that it was like a tactic rather than like, a piece. Sorry, you forget it was a tactic. Instead it becomes like the end in itself.
Yeah. I've called this in the UK like drinking your own Kool-Aid, where you tell everyone you're doing it for this reason, but actually you kind of forget it internally, and then you go off.
Totally.
Yeah, I think both in the Ask Me Anything you kind of mentioned, you're an avid reader of a social movement history, and I think this is something you did in your undergrad. I'm kind of curious. The abolition of slavery movement was, I guess, one you looked at quite a lot. I'm kind of curious. Are there any takeaways from there that, I don't know, kind of reinforce either kind of what you've said so far or how we should approach helping animals?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I find a lot of inspiration in the social movements of the past, and especially in the abolitionists who took on this deeply entrenched system of agriculture, by the way. I mean, it was farmers who were responsible for slavery. And it took on this deeply entrenched system and achieved incredible reforms. And so I think there's amazing inspiration to take from these. I also think we have to be wary about taking lessons for two reasons. The first is that what works is going to differ hugely by time and place. So I don't think the tactics that succeeded with the British Parliament in 1807 are going to be the tactics that are going to succeed with the British Parliament in 2025. Like, I think there are just big differences. There are big differences across issues on what's going to work for people. The other thing, though, is I find that when advocates look at social movement history, they largely do so to prove what they already believe. And I am as guilty of this as others. Like, my read of social movement history is like, it was all incremental reform that like, achieved a huge amount in reducing the badness of issues and then slowly built up the momentum to end the badness entirely. That is just one read of social movement history. And I think if I was a Marxist, I would have a completely different read of what had gone on. I think it's just like, I'm always skeptical of taking those lessons. So, and then perhaps I think you can take some lessons on like what not to do. So even within successful movements, it does seem like infighting has just been a destructive force throughout social movement history. Like that just seemed to be a common lesson. I think that there is, related to that, one take I have, might be a little more controversial, is that articulating completely unachievable goals also is often a divisive force, and one that just like leads people astray. And I mean, you saw this like in the marriage equality battle, for instance, for a long time, that movement in the 60s and 70s was paralyzed over whether they should be endorsing marriage as an institution at all, because a lot of them were like, marriage is an oppressive institution. So like, what the heck are we doing saying we want marriage? Like, we want to abolish marriage. And it's like, I think someone could tell you like, you're not going to abolish marriage, like whether you want to or not. Like, that's not happening, And so it's like, actually that's quite counterproductive. And then it does broadly seem like focus is pretty valuable. Again, I mean, I am probably more, putting some of my own beliefs in here, but like, it does seem like focusing as a movement has just been pretty critical to the successful movements. And by contrast, there's so many examples of movements that just like could not focus, and as a result could not achieve a lot.
Does anything come to mind in terms of specific movements that couldn't focus?
I think you can look at movements today, right, on the left, where it's just like they are just like driven by like they have to work on every problem at once. The organization is like feels like it needs to be dealing with the climate crisis, the Gaza, it needs to be dealing with like every other issue at once. And each of these can be very worthy issues in their own right. Like it's not like I think sometimes when people are like, yo, can we stop talking about that other issue? People are like, oh, you must not care about that other issue. Like you must, but it's like, no, it's just the case that I think history suggests is more effective to have advocates individually focused on just climate and advocates individually focused on just Gaza and so on than it is to have all advocates trying to do all of that at once.
A good analysis of this in the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson in terms of like how regulation in the US kind of stops building because now permits, people want to build houses has to be like very green and also has to pay a fair living wage and all this kind of stuff actually means now you can't build any housing now. It's a whole big problem because like you're trying to solve too many issues at once and you actually end up doing nothing.
Yeah, and the other thing I see in this, by the way, when it comes to animals is I sometimes see animal advocates like, again, with very good intentions, wanting to elevate other issues within their advocacy. There is no reciprocity. Like, it's not like the climate movement is like, now we're going to talk about factory farming all the time. It's just like, so I think one of the problems with this thing of like, everyone talks about all issues all the time. It's like, most people are just never going to talk about factory farming. So they're going to talk about like the top 3 most salient issues in the media all the time. And those are going to be the 3 things that get all the attention. And then the issues like factory farming that are not as salient in the media are just going to be forgotten by everyone because it's like no one is focusing on these now.
People, I guess, talk about climate change and pandemics and everything else on the way to like reach new audiences, but at the same time you're kind of like diminishing or diluting the animal welfare message. I guess, how do you see as like kind of balancing that trade-off?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of value in having coalitions around particular issues where disparate forces agree on the same thing. So I think that's what's happening, for instance, in Congress right now, where animal welfare advocates are aligning with small farmers. They don't agree on everything, but like on this particular issue, they agree it would be really bad to wipe out these laws. I think similarly, when it comes to alternative proteins, there should be a coalition between climate advocates and animal advocates because alternative proteins would be both good for the climate and good for animals. And so it makes sense. But like that doesn't mean we need to get the climate advocates on board with the cage-free campaigns, nor does it mean that we need to get on board with the other climate campaigns. And so I think it just makes way more sense to think about like where do our interests just genuinely overlap? And on those issues where we both stand to gain, where it's good for animals and another issue, like, yes, we should ally with them on those issues and build a coalition around that particular issue rather than try to build like these giant coalitions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we have around just over 10 minutes left, so I will do some kind of scattered questions, so the topic will jump a fair bit.
Sounds good.
One I'm sure it's been on the EA forum and other places recently, the impact of transformative AI on animal movement. So how should we change our priorities and our strategies, if at all, if we believe that we're going to have pretty transformative AI in the next like decade or so? Do you have any thoughts on this question?
So I think there are 2 different pieces. One is like, how should we do advocacy differently? And like, everyone should work out how to use LLMs and AI tools. And like, that's a great idea. If you haven't already, go and work it out. Like, they can make your life easier. They can make things more efficient. Like, great idea. Okay. Second thing is like, should we actually be doing advocacy around the course of AI and how things develop? And I think this is much harder because it's really hard to work out the leverage points where we could make a predictably good change. I think, for instance, I'm pretty skeptical that we can in any way influence the way in which precision livestock farming technology gets adopted. Like, I think they're going to adopt it. I think it is probably mostly going to be bad for animals. And I don't think there's a lot we can do to stop that. I think we can like support new humane tech enabled by AI, just as we could humane tech not enabled by AI. Then when it comes to like for instance, the LLMs and the other systems being developed by the labs, like I think it is good that there are people trying to benchmark them on how those AIs think about animals and trying to influence them on that, because I do think it is the case that those AIs are not enshrining the most positive views about animal welfare they could. I know there's a big debate in the AI community about how much advocacy on this now will matter in future. Like, what degree will the values that Claude or ChatGPT has today in any way influence the values that AGI has? I don't have strong views on that. But like, seems like it's probably still worth trying to influence those.
Yeah.
I don't see right now a ton of other high leverage opportunities, but I think this is a great area for exploratory work. Like, I think this is a great area for people to like go and try some things out, see if they can make an impact, and if they can, like we should scale this up.
Where does the skepticism around us not being able to influence precision livestock farming come from? Is that just, this industry's going to take off and we're not going to control it, therefore, we can only do so much?
So I think people often have these ideas that we should just like they'll see some giant force coming along. So it's like the spread of factory farming around the world to like developing countries, and they're like, oh, we should stop that. And I'm like, yeah, like we should also stop factory farming and like animal cruelty and like it's like I just think that we need a degree more humility as a movement to just be like, actually, neither we nor any social movement has the ability to stop a giant technological trend or something that is just clearly more efficient being adopted by an industry. We do have the ability to nudge things at the margin. And so to nudge for better legal protections at the margin, to nudge for all these other things at the margin. But I think just appreciating like where we have had the greatest influence so far has normally been at the margin, not in terms of like stopping an entire giant technological force.
There's a good but kind of niche podcast, the 8,000 Hours, with Alan Defoe, who works at DeepMind on technological progress and, to what extent you can shape the course of it. And his view is you can't really shape the course of it. And it's like technology is what decides history. And, we can, like you said, we can do some small things in the margin, but it's very hard to stop a major trend that's going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
We spoke about Prop 12 as being a big threat to the US movements and like a major setback. Do you have any views on other major threats or setbacks that is facing the movement right now?
I think there's been a broader pushback against animal welfare reforms from companies on cost grounds. Advocates are having success in pushing back on that, but I just see that being a bigger trend of companies trying to frame this as a battle over the price of food. I think obviously on alternative proteins, there have just been some major challenges. So there's both the challenge that in the US, UK, and some other markets, plant-based meat sales just keep on declining. And there is the challenge of all these new labeling laws and all these, like 7 states now in the US have banned cultivated meat. The European Union is trying to ban it. And so I think something we didn't adequately anticipate on that was just the force of cultural and political opposition. Like it was like, I think there was this view with alternative proteins where it's like, well, if you just make them like cheap and tasty enough, like everyone will eat them. And it's like, actually, it turns out both like we just don't want to eat them in general, but also they're very susceptible to these like cultural messaging around it's ultra processed, it's bad for you, etc., and very susceptible to getting caught up in the culture war as a political issue. And then there's just like the long-standing like terrible threat of like factory farming is expanding everywhere. and I will say on that, like on the one hand, that is deeply depressing and frustrating and everything, but also I think war is also expanding lately, and yet it is still very valuable that there are people reducing war in the world and like trying to make it be less and trying to make it be less bad, so it's like, and I'm actually more hopeful that in the very long run we will end factory farming than I am that we will end war entirely. So it's like I do think that we can achieve a huge amount even as it gets worse, and ultimately hope to change that trajectory.
Yeah, on the protein side, I think I agree that maybe people had a relatively, I don't know, simplistic or naive view that like, yes, price, taste, convenience will go well, and therefore adoption will go well. But yeah, we haven't seen this happen for a variety of reasons. It can be, like the ultra processed narrative being pushed mainly by the meat industry and like other things that's kind of stopping adoption on this kind of cultural side, especially. I'm kind of curious, do you think we kind of underinvested in this like cultural public opinion piece around alternative proteins? And I think there's a broader sentiment of this in animal welfare that there was a period where it was all kind of like change hearts and minds and actually, oh, this is really expensive and doesn't work very well, we'll do institutional stuff. Now it's like, oh wait, did we forgo that too much? And actually maybe we should tilt the scales a tiny bit back towards some of this work. Otherwise, either we can't maintain the reforms we have or stuff like alternative proteins don't actually take off as we like.
I honestly think the biggest challenge with cultural and social change right now is we haven't worked out how to achieve it. So I don't think it's like the lack of funding. I don't think it's the lack of people paying attention to it. I think that it has just gotten way harder in the current media and social media universe. So for example, a decade ago, advocates got a ton of play with undercover investigations, got picked up in huge media outlets, played all over the place. Videos on factory farming went viral on YouTube, posts went viral on Facebook. And unfortunately, some combination of the media getting distracted by other issues, afraid to report on these issues, and then the social media platforms changing their algorithms has meant that like all of that content just gets way less play than it used to. And I think the same as I have seen is true for people trying to break through the narrative, the ultra processed narrative around plant-based meat. Like it's like, yes, if we could have effective narrative change on this, that would be amazing. But I think sometimes people are like, oh, well, why don't we just invest in like more, consumer surveys and like focus groups and things? And I don't think that's the problem. Like, I think we've got plenty of messages that work. I think the problem is getting those messages in front of people and finding a way to actually get messages that go viral on social media, that go viral in the media and get picked up on. And I think that's just really hard. I think that we're just in this extremely noisy media environment that is obsessed with culture war battles. And it is really hard to break a narrative that fits that trend, like cultured meat is this imposition of the elites on the masses, or the idea that like plant-based meat is this like sinister plot to get us all to eat, ultra processed food. Like I think it is actually just really hard to counter some of those things. And so I want people to be experimenting with it. Like I really want people to be experimenting with ways to change that, because I think it's very important. But I don't think we yet have the formula of how we change it.
Yeah. You sit in a role that I'm sure means you have a lot of inbound messages, let's say, from people, either you or your team, in terms of getting funding, but also like, relatively scrutinized. And I think you also wrote on your Ask Me Anything that, even like having friendships with leaders in the movement is like kind of more challenging because of concerns around conflicts of interest and not wanting to favor people or be seen to be favoring people. Yeah, I'm kind of curious, like, what do you find emotionally taxing about your role, and like how is it hard for you?
Yeah, it is. It is emotionally taxing. I mean, I don't want to like complain, because I'm very lucky to have this role. Like, I think that like it is, this is my dream job, to be working on an issue that I am so passionate about, and to have the resources that Open Philanthropy enables us to have to enable such amazing advocates to do such cool work. So I'm very excited about that. At the same time, I think the main emotionally taxing thing is actually just something common to most advocates, which is like, it's freaking emotionally taxing thinking about this amount of animal suffering all the time, right? Like, and not just how much suffering there is. I think the fact that we are powerless to stop most of it, we can only, help a small portion of the world's factory farmed animals at this point. And the fact that most of society seems indifferent to this, like, that really still gets me. The fact that like there's just this insane moral atrocity going on, and most of society like can't be bothered paying any attention. I think that's just really hard. And so I think like something that I have tried to embrace a bit more on that is the need to take some breaks, the need to get a bit of time away from just thinking about animal suffering all the time, think more about self-care, because I think that is just a very real challenge. And then in terms of this role in particular, yeah, I mean, I think the thing I find hardest is turning down amazing people. Like, I think, all the time, because of the necessity as a funder of, we have a limited pool of money, we cannot fund everything, we end up turning down lots of people. And most of them are really incredible people. Most of them are like, I mean, by the mere fact of having devoted their lives to like alleviating the suffering, I respect them hugely. But also, it's just like incredibly talented people have achieved incredible things and great ideas. And for any kind of number of reasons, like, we're not the right fit for them, or we can't fund them at this time. And that's hard. And so like, I'm sure it's harder on them. Like, again, I don't need some feedback. I'm sure it's harder on them, like not having the funding. Like, but it's just like, yeah, that is just a brutal dynamic of operating in a space like this that does have such scarce funding and that has such incredible people who, I would love to be able to support all of them.
Maybe I had this view before I went into the funding world, where like, oh, it's like, why don't, funders just like do X and Y and, give this person money or give me money? But I guess maybe once at least I came into it, it was much more like, oh, the trade-offs are like much harder than I realized. And there's a very direct consequence of like funding one group means another great group maybe gets less money or no money. And it's actually like very challenging to make those decisions and from the inside, like.
Yeah, and I think it's often too, people just think like, oh, this is just this one piece of money right now, and it's not that much money. Like, why would you go to me? And I think what we've seen is people very reasonably have the expectation that once we start supporting them, we will keep supporting them.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that they will grow and get bigger and bigger. And so sometimes with the funding session, we're not just thinking like, could we spare $100,000 to start this project now? We're thinking, is this something that we're going to be sufficiently excited about to keep supporting for a longer period of time? Because we try to avoid scenarios. They of course happen, but we try and avoid scenarios where we start funding someone and like a year or two later just need to cut off the funding. And that also kind of raises the barrier, because it is like we are more worried about like being overly disruptive in the movement by like funding a lot of things and then cutting funding from them immediately.
Yeah, that makes sense. Or maybe one final note before doing our closing questions is, I find whenever I follow your Twitter or I watched your interview with Liv Marie, you seem to follow the animal ag industry in an unusually detailed way, just like posting photos of like random legislation or like this weird practice or something from all around the world. So it seems like something you really are, I guess, like how are you following this, and kind of curious from like what your kind of tracking of the animal ag industry looks like and how these things come up.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I'm not sure it's worth other people doing the same. Like, it is mostly a deeply frustrating thing, and also like time consuming, because most of the stuff they post is just like irrelevant. So, I mean, literally, I just use like Google Alerts and X. I wish I had a better system, but I found all the other systems more time consuming. And I found that this is a relatively quick way to find out a decent portion of what's going on. But I would say for most people, the more important thing than following the industry is like following the movement. Like following all the things that the movement is up to, I think is much more important than following what the industry is up to.
Yeah, makes sense. Maybe for those in the UK, I have a subscription to Poultry Business magazine, and it's great. It's a monthly free magazine, and it's great to see what they're saying about us and like how we're doing. Okay, moving on to our closing questions. What's one bit of news that you're excited about recently?
I was really excited in France. L214 just secured a commitment from, I think it's the LDC group, which is the biggest French chicken producer, to adopt the European chicken commitment for their two flagship brands. L214 is estimating this could affect up to 400 million birds every year. I tend to be more conservative with estimates. So let's just say, like, even if it's half of that, like over 5 years, that's over 1 billion birds. And I think sometimes we don't pause enough on just like individual victories like this to be like, that's insane. Like, most social movements never help 1 billion individuals. Like they never get to help many across many generations of work and thousands of people working on it. And like, this is just one win in this movement. So I think on the one hand, it's easy to get paralyzed by like the scale of factory farming, but also I think we should just reflect on the scale of progress we make. That like, when a group gets a win like this, that is so many individuals who are going to suffer less because of that commitment.
Yeah, I saw that as well. That's very amazing, and I think it seems like L214 has achieved pretty amazing things. So hopefully this will spread across Europe and then further.
May it spread.
Next thing is, what are some media recommendations for listeners? Could be books, podcasts, blogs, etc.
So there are some great Substacks out there. I just started recommending some of my Substacks. So rather than listing like 15, I'll like go to Farm Animal Welfare Substack and look at the ones I recommend.
Yeah, I like that.
That includes yours, James, and I'm hoping that by recommending it, I will guilt you into publishing another post one of these days.
One day.
One day. I've lately felt like Substack has been where a lot of the good content is. There's some good stuff on the EA forum too. Like I think it's worth following some of the animal welfare discussions there. And I'm sure there are a lot of podcasts that I'm missing that like I just don't, follow these things other than your podcast, of course. But
of course. I guess the final question is like, how can people follow you or hear about what either you or Open Phil are doing?
The two places that I post are on my Substack, farmanimalwelfare.substack, and on my X account. I know that X has become a total cesspool, and I wish there was a better alternative, but I'm just kind of locked in because I've like that's where my followers are, and I really can't be bothered trying to build them up on a new platform. I think it's possible Open Philanthropy will start posting some more content on our general blog and on our website, so always worth keeping an eye on that too.
Nice. Great. Well, Lewis, thanks so much for joining us. It's been pretty fun and wide-ranging, an hour and a half. So appreciate all your time and for all the work you do in the movement.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for all you're doing, James.